All the roll and go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?
Hello, and welcome to the Where Am I to Go podcast. Today we are in Sweetwater, Texas, and we are with Lisa at the WASP Museum. I don't know exactly what WASP stands for, but it's not the little flying bugs that you see going out of bee nests and that sting you. But I think that there was some stinging that was involved with this in a different formal way. Welcome, Lisa, to Where Am I to Go podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't you fill me in on what WASP is?
Yeah, so it is Women Airforce Service Pilots.
Okay.
So General Hap Arnold, who was head of the Army Air Corps, really liked acronyms, as the story goes. And you know, Air Force is two words, but he wanted a clean acronym, so he put Air Force together as one word in order to make the acronym work.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's, okay, so they were women Air Force pilots.
Service pilots.
Service pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, why the word service?
That's interesting. Probably because they weren't military. They weren't militarized. They were flying military airplanes. They were under the control and discipline of the military, but they were civilians.
Oh, really?
They were, and they would not be militarized until 35 years after their service.
So are they still going today?
No. The program lasted for 2 years, from 1944 from 1942 until 1944.
Okay.
They were disbanded in December of 44.
Okay. And they weren't recognized as far as being military workers, or what, till 35 years later?
Right. And 35 years later, when the Army announced that they would be recruiting women and accepting them into their pilot academies, the Army said, you know, these are going to be the first women to fly for the armed forces. And the WASP, who went home very quietly and just lived out their lives, when they heard this, it did not take too well. And so they said, no, we were the first to fly military aircraft. And so they started a 5-year campaign, very organized campaign, to get the recognition that they so deserved.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, in other words, they worked for the military as civilians.
Yes.
So that means that they didn't get any of the GI benefits that any of the military got that served in World War II. They didn't have access to the veterans hospital stuff, or any of the housing loans, or any of that.
Right, they didn't have any of that. In fact, they were paid about the level of a second lieutenant, so they received pay. And while they were in service, they had no insurance. The Army wouldn't insure them. And then on top of that, when they entered the program, their insurance companies at home dropped them. And so they had no insurance.
So if they got injured on the job?
Nothing. And so 38 women died in service, and there were no death benefits. And so they would get that tragic phone call, you know, from the Army. And then the WASP sisters would pass around a hat to collect money to send the body home on a train with an escort.
On a train?
On a train.
Because they were pilots, you send them home on a train.
Right.
Okay, this makes sense.
Yeah. And then,
not really.
Yeah, and then the families, of course, had to pay for the funerals. There was no military flag on the casket, and they weren't even allowed to put the star in the window, you know, that all the other families did when they lost someone in the military. They didn't get those either. So it was, you know, and the Army didn't feel bad about it. You know, and the WASP themselves didn't feel bad about it, because to them, they signed up for it. You know, the Army said, this is the deal. This is what you're going to do. Do you want to do it or not? Well, these ladies wanted to. I mean, they did it for honor and for love of flying. And a lot of them have even said over the years, we would have done it for free. I mean, and think about it. This is 1942. and the whole country's pulling together.
Right.
You've got Victory Gardens, Rosie the Riveter. You've got women now in factories and going into all the branches of the armed forces. These ladies said, we can fly. And there was a massive shortage of pilots. And so they kept pounding on the door. It took a while to get in, but they kept saying, look, you have a massive shortage of pilots to do everything that needs to be done stateside. We can do this here at home, and our men are free for combat missions. And that's what they needed. But at first, you know, the Hap Arnold, and this is a little bit of conjecture, I just don't think he wanted to be responsible for a woman dying in an aircraft. And so he kept saying no, no, no. So, but finally, Eleanor Roosevelt, you know, she had her own newspaper, her own podcast of the day. She had a weekly column. And she said, you know, this is no time to hold back. We have a secret weapon waiting to be used, and that weapon is women.
And I would be willing to bet that women at the time, because times were so different, just the opportunity to get out of, let's say, the house or that type of environment would be very encouraging, especially with something as exhilarating as flying. Now, while we were watching the little video you have going on over here, Linda and I were talking, and she was talking about how exhilarating it would have been at that time to be able to go fly.
Yeah.
And I says, do you think Rosie the Riveter felt the same way? Because I don't think riveting would be that glorious or fantastic of a job.
Yeah.
But these ladies, it looks like, had a pretty good thing going.
They had a good time, but you know, they had a kind of a different personality, and I think that's one thing you have to keep in mind. I don't know that Rosie the Riveter wanted to fly. You know, some people look at that and think, not me.
Right.
But you know, and especially in those days, you know, there were a lot of accidents, there were a lot of fatalities, and you know, not everybody loved it enough to say, okay, I'll accept that risk.
Right.
You know, it takes a special group of people to say, I'm that confident in my skills. And furthermore, if I die, I died in an airplane and that was a good day. Yeah. Not everybody is going to feel that way.
Now, did they train these women the same as what they trained the military men pilots, or were they given half the training?
No, this is really, they got full training. You know, there was 2 women who had been working independently to get a women's program started. And one of them, she got her program started first, and they were just in charge of ferrying aircraft because the government had promised Russia almost 7,000 planes through the Lend-Lease program of World War II. So all those had to be ferried from factories to Great Falls, and then you know, from there they were ferried on and they made their way to Russia. And so General William Tunner was over that program, and he was desperate. And when he realized that there was a civilian woman working for him that was a trained pilot, he approached her. It was Nancy Love, and he said, are there other women like you? And she said, yes, sir, I can pull together 30 easily. And these women had commercial license. They had over 500 hours of flight time. They had cross-country experience. I mean, they were the hotshot female pilots of the day.
Wow.
So they didn't get any training. They were hired. And then they just started. Well, right on the heels of that, Jacqueline Cochran, who was an incredible aviatrix of her day, I mean, broke all kinds of records, you know, racing records, and she was a business executive, and she was pretty amazing. She said, wait a minute, I've been trying to get a program through, and why did you give her a program and not me? She went directly to Arnold, and she was a force to be reckoned with. I always laugh and say if she had been a man, no one would have had a problem with her personality. But I've heard her described as if you want something done, you would want to get her, but you wouldn't necessarily want her to be your neighbor.
Right.
You know, she had a very lovely aspect to her quality, but also, you know, she was very ambitious. So she went to Hap Arnold and said, look, women can do far more than ferry. They can do all these other jobs, but you're going to have to train them because they haven't flown. They've been flying little Cubs. They haven't flown these big military aircraft, but they can. And if you'll give them the exact same training as the men, they're going to fly well for you, and they're not going to have any more accidents than the men do. It'll be comparable. So he agreed because he was up against the wall. They needed those pilots overseas. So that's what they started. And the first 2 classes started in Houston at Avenger Field.
Okay.
And but it wasn't a good space for them. The airspace was congested. The weather is often rainy and foggy, so that's a lot of days down. And they didn't have housing for the women. They had them all over town, and then they would have to bus them in. Well, here, where the museum is, it was a military field. It was named Avenger Field.
Okay.
And they had trained a lot of classes of men, and the ones that were there at the time were the Royal Air Force.
Okay.
And so they were wrapping up with their training, and they were going to be shipping out. And so Dee Dee Deaton, who was Jackie's right-hand woman, found out about it, and she said, we've got to move them there. Let's just go. And so they did. When they were in the middle of the 3rd class of WASP, they ferried all the airplanes over here and landed, here on the field and kept the training going and graduated from Avenger Field.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the barracks we see as we're coming in were all WASP barracks. Because as you're driving into this facility, there's a whole series of barracks.
No, those were not their barracks. Those were built in the 70s. This field has been used in every conflict that we've had through Vietnam. I always flip Korea and Vietnam. But that was the last time it was used. So those were built for those conflicts.
Okay.
There were barracks. My big goal is to have a diorama in here at some point.
Okay.
And I have a picture over there that I could show you. But the airfield, if you stand in between our 2 buildings, you see the runways. You see the space where the runways are. And north of that is the airport. And you can see our airport from there. That's where all their barracks and their hangars were. They were on the other side of those runways.
Okay.
And then this older hangar next to this one was the airport. It was built in 1929, and it served as the first airport for the city of Sweetwater.
Okay. Now, were these women ferrying the planes over to Russia, or were they mostly just in the U.S.?
They had to stay within the U.S. A couple of the original 28 got to do a couple of missions to Great Britain, but the big rule was you don't leave the continental U.S. So they would take them to Great Falls, and then our male pilots would take them to Alaska, and then in Alaska, Russian male and female pilots picked them up from Alaska and took them home to Russia.
So Russia had female pilots also?
They did, and so did Britain.
Okay.
But in Russia, they fought. They were in combat in Russia.
Okay, but they didn't have a fancy name like WASP over there.
Well, they called them they called them the Night Witches.
Ooh.
And that is a whole different podcast, and I would encourage you to read a book on that. They were tough. But yes, they were pretty cool. So yeah, the ladies, our WASP begged to ferry them all the way to Alaska, and the government said no way. They said, there's no facilities for you in Alaska.
Okay.
I know. What does that mean?
Who knows?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I guess they had their reasoning.
Yeah.
Still pretty cool that they were able to do that.
Yeah.
Now, were the Rosie the Riveter, those group of women, were they considered part of the military, or were they civilian also?
They were civilian because they worked in factories. They just took the hometown jobs because, the men were gone overnight. So they took hometown jobs. Now, there were women that were militarized. There were the WACs, which was the women's, I think it was the Army Corps. There were the Waves. They were in the Navy.
Okay.
So they entered all 4 branches. But they did clerical work, they did that sort of thing, and their jobs were important. I don't want to downplay that because, the world goes round because you've got the right people doing the right work. I'm sure they were in supply and logistics and, all those things. So.
No, I wasn't trying to downplay anything because they're all, like you said, they're all important.
Yeah, they were militarized. They were. But not the pilots. That was the one area
That's just
that they would.
So interesting.
I know, because why not them?
Right.
And no one's really been able to answer that.
Now, when we were watching the film over here, It looks like the training must have been pretty extensive because they're doing acrobatics and all kinds of other things. This wasn't just a get in the plane and fly it from point A to point B. They must have been doing loop-de-loops and upside downs and all kinds of other things according to what the video's showing. So they must have had fun while they were flying.
They did, and a lot of it was straight and level. And a lot of these military planes aren't, you know, they're not fit for acrobatics. But one of the traditions was that when they would have, you know, successfully pass a check ride, pass a level, they could go up with their instructor and do some maneuvers. You know, so that was part of it. But some of the acrobatics you see is them practicing going into stalls and spins.
Okay.
Because that's really critical, because sometimes you do stall and spin.
Now, did they all have male trainers, or were there female trainers also?
So they were almost all male. There was one that I know of that was female, and she resigned and became a WASP.
Oh.
So she trained, I think she trained a class or two, and then she said, actually, I want to do that. And so they didn't make her start at the beginning. She actually got to start mid-level training and go from there. So, and there may have been another one or two, because I've seen it when I've read books written by WASP, I've seen them refer to female, but all our class photos that we have are all men.
Okay.
So I'm not really sure. You know, history, unfortunately, it's not always meticulously documented.
Okay.
And so sometimes, you know, people will kind of squabble with me about one fact or another, and I just have to say, you know, you read that book and I read this book, and you know, the government didn't weigh in on that, and you know. Well,
where they weren't registering them as officers or anything else, there could have been trainers possibly that just were buried in the background.
I don't know, but I mean, they ran a really tight ship here. The other thing is, you know, the program was so tenuous, and when the ladies first came here, there were a lot of accusations that they only wanted to fly so that they could date, you know, the male pilots. You know, that they were just, you know, looking for husbands or a good time. And so Jackie Cochran, of course, didn't want any talk. And so she tried to reduce the drama as much as possible, so there were no men allowed here, with the exception of the support staff, which would have been the trainers, mechanics, and things like that. So, but no male cadets could be here. Okay. And so the girls nicknamed it Cochran's Convent. You know, because they were young girls in the prime of their lives. And, you know, it was sort of,
young men in the primes of their lives.
Exactly, yeah. And so, but, you know, Cochran really, she didn't want to rock the boat. And so the mantra became, you know, you want to look and act like a woman, and you want to fly like a man. You have to fulfill your societal role, which is to always look good, be womanly, but then you've got to fulfill this military goal of being the best pilot in the room.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, were they flying all classes of planes? Were they flying the fighters, the bombers, and all the planes? Were they trained specifically in each plane, or did they fly across the board? They never knew what they were getting into.
So a little bit of all of that. They did fly every class of plane. While they were here, they went through the same trainers that the men did. So they wouldn't have trained on a fighter or a bomber, but there was a specific order. They went through the order. You know, when they graduated, they got their wings. And then, of course, for some, you know, if they were stationed, let's say, okay, some were stationed in Lubbock, which is just a couple of hours north of here. And they trained men how to fly gliders. And so they had to learn how to fly the Lodestar, and they would tow those glider planes and teach the men how to, you know, detach and land and glide down. And so, you know, if they routinely did the same job, of course they got trained in that plane.
Right.
The ladies that were ferrying flew mostly P-63s and P-39s, and they, you know, they got that. But really, at any given day, they could be flying something different.
Okay.
So, for instance, there have been accounts of, you know, being sent to a base. We need you to ferry this plane. She'd look at it and go, I haven't flown that one before. Well, here's the instruction manual. And she would read it and look at it and go, okay, yeah. I mean, and I think that really that's what made them such good pilots, because they couldn't rely on muscle memory. And so they would read the instruction manual, and they did every step it told you to do.
Okay.
Right? They didn't skip steps. Where sometimes the men tended to get a little more confident. It wasn't that the women were better, but they would get really confident in their own skills, and they'd say, well, we don't really need to do this step or really need to do that step. And it caused serious accidents.
Yeah.
Now, you said there was only 39 women that died.
38.
38.
Yeah.
In the service.
Right.
So that means that you had 15 plane wrecks or so in the whole time that they were flying?
No, they flew solo. So it was 38 women that died.
38, okay.
Yeah.
And they all died?
They all died separately. Yes, I see what you mean.
Yeah, I thought maybe they had a pilot, co-pilot situation.
They flew by
solo.
themselves. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
They rarely flew together. So yeah, they did fly solo. There was one, accident where two of them had a mid-air collision coming into land. The sun was at a certain angle; they couldn't see each other, but it's still two planes.
Right.
But yeah.
That still isn't a bad record for as many planes as they had to have been ferrying at the time.
They did. I think they did really well. I mean, a little over 1,100 flew, 38 died. The washout rate, in training, the washout rate was on par with the men. Just over 1,800 were accepted into the formal WASP program, where they did receive the formal training. 1,074 graduated, and so that was the same passing rate as the men.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's all that were enlisted was 1,074?
Yes, because they disbanded the program. Their plan was to continue training women.
Okay.
But when the war started winding down, there was far less demand. It's not that there wasn't work to do, but there was less demand, and they were still drafting. And so then at that point, it went from releasing men to go to combat to replacing men. Because you had some men being drafted who did know how to fly. Well, they didn't want to go overseas. They didn't want to go to combat. They wanted those jobs here. And so the news media, like they do today, started a firestorm of why are we investing all this money training new women when we have these men? And so the bill was presented to Congress to militarize the women at that time so they could have stayed flying. It failed. I've heard someone say it was the only time that Hap Arnold did not get what he asked for, because he backed it. He said,
He was reluctant at first, and then
they proved
jumped on
themselves.
full board.
When he came to give his last graduation speech, they all knew they were being disbanded. Those last women that graduated would never serve. And they were given a choice. Do you want to finish training or go home? Because they found out in October. So some of them did go home, but the rest stayed. And, the sweetest quote he ended it with, he said, what started out as an experiment is no longer an experiment. You've proven that you and 900 of your sisters can fly wingtip to wingtip with your brothers.
Wow.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is cool.
That
A
is.
lot of validation in that moment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And he said, we'll never forget your service. And, unfortunately, everybody did. I mean, it wasn't, some people have said it was sealed. And it wasn't really sealed, but, it was just truly forgotten. People moved on. They didn't know. When the women tried to tell people, yeah, we served as pilots, no one believed them. So they just quit. They just stopped the dialogue.
And how many of these women continued to fly after their service?
Almost none.
Almost none.
Almost none. One B.A. who was a WASP, she said, I don't think I've ever been told no in so many different ways. They got out and they applied to everything, because commercial airlines were in full swing. They applied to everything. And no. They could be stewardesses. Yeah. They could be secretaries.
But why would you want to walk the aisles when you've flown the plane?
And that's the thing. And I asked a couple of them, I said, well, why don't you go back to flying what you flew before the war? And they said, after you've flown bombers and fighter jets and, it's no fun to go back and just fly a Cub, that was just nothing, so.
Wow.
Yeah, they just kind of moved on.
That's really kind of disappointing.
Yeah. It really was. And, the women were allowed to join the military afterwards, but not as pilots.
Right, secretaries.
200 did join. They did not active duty, but they did reserves. So 200 of them joined as reservists. And the minute they got pregnant, they were kicked out.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
So it didn't last long, and they didn't really use them a lot, so.
That's too bad.
It is too bad.
I mean, it's bad that there was that
Yeah.
much training put into something.
Yeah.
Time-wise, from the woman's perspective.
Yeah,
To
yeah.
just let it all go.
I know because they spent a lot of money getting him there, and that's where I give the government kudos. I mean, they really gave those ladies excellent training, and sometimes they'd send them back for further training, for further officer training, and I noticed even when they announced the disbandment in October, they were still sending women for additional training, which I
Wow.
found very curious. But they just kept the program going exactly as it was until it was no longer.
Maybe they didn't feel so secure that everything was done or something.
I don't know. It was heartbreaking.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, we're inside of the museum.
Okay.
And this is a pretty nice area. It's big. What? Probably 60 by 60 or 100 by 100?
No,
or-
it's probably 90 by 90.
90 by 90.
Yeah, 90 by 100. Yeah.
And you've got all kinds of different displays. So let's
Yeah.
take a walk and take a look at some of
Okay.
your favorite displays.
Okay.
You were telling us beforehand that you're in the process of upgrading a bunch of your displays.
Yes.
That you've got some professional designers coming in that had designed several other museums. So I guess what we're going to see today is going to be just enough to whet the appetite of somebody who comes in
Yeah.
another year or
Yes.
so.
Exactly, because it'll be a much more complete story. Right now we focus a lot on training because the training did happen here. And that's what the museum is. Today this is considered a remote spot. Back in the day, it wasn't. We had a thriving airport. We had 5 railroads. We were on the Bankhead Highway, which goes east to west. So it was a great location.
Now you're on Interstate 40, right?
20.
20, okay.
20, right on the interstate. So, I was mentioning it was a women's area only. One of my favorite things is, I'd like to have this picture blown up, but if you look carefully, look at those flight suits. Do you see?
They're pretty baggy.
Yes. So, the government had no intention of spending any money on women who may or may not be able to fly the military planes. So they sent the men's surplus in size 44 long. And they all got that size. It didn't
All of
matter.
them.
All of them got that size. And so they'd roll up the sleeves, they'd roll up the pants, they'd put big belts around it, and they just, they made it work.
That is funny.
Yeah.
Because that's a big size.
It is a bit, one of my volunteers really put it in perspective with a group one day. She said, she's 6 feet tall herself, and she said, my husband's 4 inches taller than I am, and that would fit him.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and then a lot bigger in the chest
Yeah.
and a lot bigger in the waist.
Everywhere, yeah,
And
exactly.
people back then weren't nearly as big as what they are now. I mean,
Right.
I don't know if I want to use the word obesity crisis, but I know that when I was in high school and I look back at my yearbook,
Yeah,
people were a whole lot thinner in
Yeah.
the 70s in high school than what they are now.
today, yeah.
And so just thinking that the 44 long would fit a woman in any way is...
Well, they didn't think that. They just went, this is all we have. And that's what it boiled down to. So, but yeah, they would come in and they'd get their flight suit in 44 long. Of course, no matching shoes. I mean, they were a really little ragtag group of ladies.
And what all were
initially.
they allowed to bring personal-wise?
So it's so interesting. This document over here is a letter from Jackie Cochran, and it tells them exactly what they can and cannot bring. And so she gave them a specific number of pants, of shirts, shoes, toiletries, because they had, a Army-issued cot and one tiny little narrow closet. I mean, it's probably 2 feet wide maximum, and then a trunk. And that's all the space that they got. They shared 6 to a room and 12 to a bathroom. And that bathroom,
wow.
yeah, that bathroom only had, 2 sinks, 2 toilets, 2 showers. Wow. And they all had to get through there in the mornings, and that beauty standard always applied. In fact, they were required, I'm not making this up, they had to keep a comb and a tube of lipstick on their person at all times. And so when the airplane would land, before they got out of the cockpit,
I was
Yeah.
noticing that on the film over here, and I
Yes.
made comment to Linda. I said, boy, they even put on makeup when they got through flying.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
that is unbelievable.
Yeah, they did. And it's just, and of course the lady pilots today laugh and go, "Oh my word! I've never had a comb or a tube of lipstick in my flight suit ever."
Was it a color that was issued, like
No.
Army green, or could they pick any color?
No, it was pretty red. It was pretty. So, but yeah. But, they started off, I'm sorry, they would have brought things like, sheet music with them and things for entertainment and things like that. But they didn't have, their days were long. I mean, they were out the door at 7 in the morning and it was lights out at 10 o'clock at night because they spent half the day in ground school, half the day in flight school, and then an hour of calisthenics. And then at night they were studying. I mean, they'd have dinner, they have to study. They had chores they had to do. They had to keep their rooms, picture perfect, and then go to bed. It was exhausting.
Can you imagine the pecking order as to who was going to get up first and who was going to get to sleep in order to use that restroom?
I have no idea how that even worked. I have no idea. But I think kind of one of my favorites is they had a general that was going to come visit one day, and they wanted to look nice. They felt, pretty embarrassed. These flight suits, they named them zoot suits. They always called them that.
And why were they called zoot suits?
So it's a Hispanic culture. At the time, the Hispanics had these really big, wide jackets that they wore. It was some kind of Latin style, and they were called zoot suits. And I think somehow the ladies sort of made some association. But when this general was going to come, they thought, we just can't present ourselves this way. So they ran out and they bought khaki pants and a white button-down shirt, and they were issued garrison caps. So they had the garrison cap. They might or might not have had a flight jacket. And then, of course, they always had their own shoes. And so they thought, well, at least we look somewhat uniform. So they all gathered out on the flight line to wait for the general. And, of course, he's a no-show.
Oh, no.
But they named it the General's Whites. That became, and they wore that a lot after that, they would wear it. We see pictures of them at graduation, the ones that weren't graduating, the ones that were just marching and, supporting the graduation. This is what they would wear.
Okay.
But
now, at the time, women weren't wearing a lot of pants.
Oh, no.
I mean, it was mostly dress code.
Yes.
And so finding pants that fit women correctly anyway would have been kind of rough.
Yeah. Yeah, they had a few days to pull that together, and I don't know the details of where.
They must have had a pretty good clothing store in town in order to come up with, what did you say, 44?
It would have been more because there were several classes on campus at any given time because they'd come in, at different times, and there was always someone graduating and always a new class coming in. But that's a good question, and I don't know the answer.
Okay. Yeah, it just seems like it'd be kind of hard to come up with.
Do that,
with that. Okay.
Well, about halfway through the program in late 43, when they were doing so well, Hap Arnold decided that they could have uniforms. And so he had Jackie Cochran have them designed. And, in addition to being a pilot, she owned a cosmetics company and a jewelry company. And so she was a very beautiful and fashionable woman.
Okay.
And so he said, go have them designed in khaki, because that's what they wore. And as legend says, she said, my girls, she didn't tell him this, but she said, my girls will not wear that ugly khaki color. So she went to Bergdorf Goodman, and she had them designed two, one in khaki and one in this Santiago blue.
Okay.
And she knew that the generals were going to sign off on it. The ladies were going to go down the runway, and the generals were going to choose. So she had those two. She hired two models. She got one very attractive model, put her in the blue, and she got one very average-looking model, put her in the khaki, sent them down, and wouldn't you know, blue.
Amazing the way that'd work.
Yeah. Yes.
And then they also designed a skirt and overcoat.
And yes, and all of that. So this was a utility flying suit, which they flew in, which also presented problems at hotels because it was scandalous to go get a woman by herself in pants to get a hotel room. Scandalous. And
really?
So eventually, because sometimes they were denied, so eventually they started saying, we're elevator operators.
Oh.
And that worked. Because when they'd say, we're pilots.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, when they say, well, we're pilots, I'd say, you are not. you know, you're a liar. Get out of here.
Wow.
There's no way you're flying for the military.
Even when they had their wings on and the WASP pin. Wow.
They just thought it was some sick hoax.
That's crazy.
It's just so
but
unfamiliar.
there again, you know, you don't have the mass media at that point in time like what we have now. So,
right.
You know, the Facebook page showing that you're in the WASPs and having it out there might have been a little bit tougher. In fact, you didn't even have TV really at that time.
No, it was tough.
So the only way you'd have heard about them, I guess, in mass would have been over one of the fireside chats.
And newspaper. You know, we have a lot of newspaper articles. But, you know, if you were in the town that saw that newspaper article, you know, it just, some people really knew who they were, but some really didn't. So that's their cold weather suit. And then it morphs into these are uniforms that our current fighter pilots have donated to the museum. So it's just fun to see the trajectory of 1940s housewife, you know, all the way down to this.
Now, are the women wearing these more modern suits?
Yeah.
Because you've got one from the Thunderbirds.
Yeah.
And
we have one from a B-1 bomber, and then Kim Scott, she served in the 90s. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and she's a pilot for Alaska now.
That's really neat to be able to see that evolution of military wear.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot of fun. And of course, this just pays a lot of homage to our instructors. That was an instructor uniform. This is what they would have worn. You see that.
Actually, it looks patch. A lot like the uniform that they went downtown and bought.
Exactly. But I adore this patch. If you see, it's two little birds holding wings.
Yep.
And so I thought that was really
They're kind
neat.
of comic-looking birds. I don't know what kind of birds they
would be.
But,
almost like buzzards, really.
Yeah.
So we recreated the patch, and we don't sell it, but we give it to instructor pilots when they come through.
Oh, cool.
So.
Okay, now the women were also given a lot of education and training in the mechanics of the airplane, it looked like.
Yeah.
And also in communications with Morse code and some of that.
That was all part of their ground school. Because they had to be able to get themselves out of difficulties. You know, one of my favorite stories was Donnie Donaldson was flying to Great Falls, and she had a mechanical issue. She knows she has to land and fix her plane. She's in a deserted area. She thinks she sees a deserted highway, so she starts to land. This is a Russian plane she's flying. She goes in for the landing, and toward the end, she realizes there's a bus right underneath her. Ooh. She lands in front of the bus, and so that airplane has the Russian insignia on it. So these people, it was a passenger bus, so they just saw a Russian plane land, and as if that wasn't enough, right, out steps this tall, willowy blonde. And they're all staring at each other for a minute, and finally the bus driver goes, "Well, lady, did you get tired of flying?" So she could tell he was not really finding the situation great, and so she got in there, she repaired her plane. You know, she did it as fast as she could, and then got back in and went off in a legendary cloud of dust.
Wow.
But so they had, you know, that was the point of ground school. I mean, sometimes you had to call for help and get someone to come get the plane, but if it was a simple enough repair, you needed to be able to do that and get yourself home.
And I'll bet the instruction manual was really easy for her to read.
Yeah.
On a Russian plane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But from what I read, it was a pretty standard little issue, you know? So anyway. But yeah, so yeah, you know, these are for our support staff. There were hundreds of people. I think over 400 or 500 people in support, you know, from mechanics to cooks to nurses, instructors, you know, ground school and flight. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
You've got a airplane mock-up here.
It's an original cockpit of a BT-13, which is a basic trainer. So it would have been the second airplane in training. You know, the primaries first. They would have gone to the BT. And yes, we had a generous group of gentlemen who restored our BT-13 that we have in the other hangar, but they also gave us this so that people could get in it.
Cool.
And so that's one thing we like about our museum is we let you actually touch and feel some things.
Okay, I wasn't sure if this was a simulator or...
No, it's not.
It's just a cockpit
It's
you can
just
sit
a
in.
cockpit, yep.
Good for pictures.
Yeah, it is. It's a great little picture. So these are wonderful pictures of just some of their time in Sweetwater. You see, them learning mechanics and Morse code, and you see them over there just being silly and blowing off steam. And then over there are pictures of ranch rodeos. When they moved here, the community wasn't particularly accepting. They just trusted these non-traditional women. So Jackie Cochran made a plea through the newspaper to please accept these women and just befriend them, because she said, if you don't, who will? And so they did. They started inviting them to their homes and taking them, swimming out on the lake. And then they put on these ranch rodeos. And so they would go see these demonstrations, and they'd put them on the horses. And not that they had a lot of time for that, but every other weekend or so they'd get some time just for fun.
This series of pictures is really a lot of fun. You have them dressed in shorts with their flight jackets on, which is kind of what are they?
They're in their skivvies.
They're in their skivvies? That had to have been a scandalous picture at that time.
We have the backside where they're mooning the camera.
Really?
These ladies like to have some fun.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So that's
I'll bet the trainers didn't mind at all.
Yeah, probably not. No. Yeah.
And then another one where they're at a bathhouse.
That's actually our municipal pool, swimming pool, which is still there. They used it for training, but that clearly they were just there having fun. So, but yeah.
Having to learn how to inflate that life vest with the little CO2 cartridge.
Yeah, and just I don't know about that, but falling in with all their clothes on, and trying to figure out how to swim out and that sort of thing. So.
And then the ranch rodeo photos are also really kind of fun. You've got a couple of ladies that are sitting on a fence or posing, but then you've got some that are working at a branding. Another one that's really kind of a funny picture, you've got a cowboy holding on to the ears of a horse pulling forward so the lady can get on and he won't buck.
Yep.
I'm sure that when he let go of those ears, it wasn't fun.
Probably not. Probably not. So.
Okay.
But yeah, these are just models of the 5 planes that they used for training.
Okay.
So those were the 3. These 2 were for primary, basic, and these 2 were for advanced.
Okay.
So you would have, with the Stearman or the Fairchild, you would have done one or the other, not both. If you were here in 43, it was the Fairchild. If you were here in 44, it was the Stearman.
Really? I would have thought the biplane would have been the first one.
And they're both about equal. And so my understanding, they had the Fairchilds here the first year, and then some of they moved them all out to send them to some of the male training fields, and then they brought in the Stearmans.
Okay.
So, yep, this is the advanced trainer, the AT6, and then the UC-78, which was the first twin engine.
The twin engine, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is a simulator. We just someone donated that to the museum about 3 months ago.
And do you get to sit in that and simulate?
You can. I never do because I have never have any time. But yeah.
That's sad.
I know. It is.
I might have to try that out
You can
here.
try that.
See how badly I can crash.
Yeah, that's what I did the few times I've done it.
And this is another trainer?
This is a Link trainer. It's not restored, so it looks really nothing like the original. But this was the first simulator ever invented. It was invented in World War I by a man named Edwin Link.
Okay.
And they called it the black box. There's a picture over there, but it had a cover that came over and the little wings and such. And then they would simulate different conditions in there, so that they could learn how to fly in bad weather and at night. And of course, they avoided bad weather and nighttime weather at all costs. But sometimes you're just stuck. You're going to have to know what to do. Yeah.
Okay.
So. And then this simulates a lot of our ground school. You got the Morse code station, and these are replicas of books that, questions they had to answer, things they had to do. So that's fun. These are the 38 that died.
Well, that's the 38 that died.
Yes.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And you've got a bronze statue of one of the ladies.
It just, it's not one particular woman. This was designed and casted by a WASP. Her name was Shootsy Reynolds. She was an artist.
Okay.
And a lot of our jewelry in the gift shop came from her molds.
Okay.
So she did that just as a tribute to all. You'll notice the name of the statue is The Graduate. So it was for all of them, and she gave it to us.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, and that's nice that you've got a wall for the 38.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I'd like to showcase all of them, but we do have that, and then we do have a special exhibit on the other side of that wall that showcases a particular WASP, and it's always changing. Our hope is that in some way we'll be able to honor all of them, whether it's in a physical wall or digitally, on the website, that we'll honor every single WASP before it's said and done.
There probably aren't a whole lot more of them around. I mean,
No, we're talking about the whole list, but there's 14 left.
There is still 14
14
left.
by our best accounts.
I was going to say, they've all got to be in their 80s and 90s
No,
at least.
they're 100 and over.
Aren't they 100? I guess that's true.
Think about it. The war was 80 years ago.
80 years ago.
Yeah.
And they had to be 19 or so before they entered.
And a lot of them were in their early 20s. So, they...
Well, that's amazing that you still got 14 that are over 100.
I know.
Have you got all their stories documented? And
as best we can. We don't have all their stories because not everybody put information out there.
Right.
But we're constantly working at it. We're not done. We're constantly meeting new families and adding to what we know and taking in new collections, and we want to tell the most complete story we can.
This is so cool.
Yeah, it is fun. This is about all the, some of the things they did when they left here. One of their other big jobs, in addition to ferrying, was they towed targets for live gunnery practice.
Oh, that sounds like a safe job.
So there's a plane. This is a target that Beverly Beesmeyer sneaked out. They weren't supposed to take him.
Okay.
But she sneaked him out, and time has not been kind, but you can see this really faint red circle.
Right.
That's a bullseye. And then they would stand there and shoot, and they had some mechanism for colored ink, and so they could see how they were doing. But they did that, and then they also did, they'd buzz down near the pilots. They did, all those things to get them ready, to go to combat.
And none of them died that are towing the target?
No, they got hit by friendly fire for sure, but nobody died doing that.
This, but when I was a kid, we used to ride our bicycle with things tied behind it and shoot at it with BB guns.
Yeah.
I did get hit many times.
I bet.
That was just a BB. I can't imagine if they're shooting something a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
Especially flying into it, because it doesn't look like she's towing it that far behind her
No,
plane.
it's not that far. She said when no one's looking, she'd try to add a foot or two. These were all the duty bases, and all of them in the country, and there was a WASP at every single base at one point or another. So these were all the different kinds of jobs that they did. Although, I would say, ferrying, tow targets, training. They did a lot of test flying. They'd take planes in to be repaired, and then they'd fly them after they're repaired
to make sure
they're okay. And so that was a lot of it. So those are their jobs. Logbooks, which are interesting because they look nothing like today's logbooks. So
since I don't know what today's logbooks look like.
Yeah. I mean, they're just much bigger. More printing. So anyway.
And did the military keep all of the logbooks and that kind of stuff for history, or did that kind of go out with the WASPs are gone and so's the history?
Your logbook is yours as a pilot. And so they took their logbooks with them. So we have, logbooks that have been donated. This is a donated logbook out of someone's collection. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, these are orders, military orders, where to go. Yeah.
You've really got a nice collection. Okay, now, when we were watching the video, it looked like all of these women were wearing parachutes also.
They did.
That was a parachute that they were wearing?
They did. They wore a parachute that, of course, wasn't made for their bodies.
Did they get parachute training?
Nobody got a lot of that, maybe half an afternoon. Even the men didn't get a lot of that. So they did, there were some that did have to, roll out of the plane with a parachute. If you look here, if you successfully parachute out, you get to keep the ripcord.
The ripcord. Oh.
Yeah. So that's the ripcord.
That's what kind of brought it up, was seeing that.
Was that, yeah. A lot of them, one WASP, her plane was going down, and she was determined. She was terrified that if she jumped, the parachute would rip her arms off. So she made the decision to stay with her plane. She thought, well, I'm either going to land and survive or land and die, but I'm not jumping. So anyway, she made it. She landed and she was okay. But there's a couple of them, one of them that happened here in training that had to jump out. They were having some kind of mechanical failure. And her instructor made her jump. He said, you've got to get out of here. I don't know what's happening. So she jumped, and he did land it fine. I think it did hurt the plane, but he lived. And of course, everyone was saying, oh, what was it like? What was it like? And she said, oh, it was pretty cool, And she goes, but the whole way down, I was afraid I was going to land on a snake. That's what she was thinking.
Yeah. Fly out of an airplane, but scared to land on a snake.
Yeah.
And with the roundups they have here in this area, I guess that snake fear would be legitimate.
Yeah. That was before they started rounding them up. So anyway, now we do that every year for, profit and control, population control. But on this side, this is really one of my favorites. I mean, this is where we spotlight a specific WASP film. So we do her life before, during, and after.
Okay.
And this is the one that changes all the time. We're going to a smaller format where we're going to showcase, 5 or 6 at one time and leave them up for the whole year. And so it'll be a little bit smaller, but we'll get to honor more women.
And then when you get through with this display, do you microfilm it and put it into book form so that you have the book documented?
It's not book form, but it's digitized.
Okay.
And so you can go on our website. You can look at past WASP in the Spotlight, so you can see the items on the website. And so it's there for your research, and we have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do you have other things in Hangar 2, or is that just getting ready for the new edition of your museum?
We have 2 aircraft. Our third one is still in the middle of an engine overhaul, but we have 2 aircraft there. And then we have a replica of one of the rooms. They call everyone calls them barracks, but the outside is a barrack, the inside is a bay. So it's the bay of where the ladies slept. So there's not as much as after the remodel. There'll be a lot of information over there, but that's coming in July of 23.
Okay.
So yeah.
Well, we'll probably walk over there when we're done with the podcast. You mentioned that you have a website.
Yes.
What is your website?
waspmuseum.org.
That's a hard one to remember.
Yes, isn't it?
Okay.
It's good. Yes, I think it's pretty rich in information.
Good. We'll have to go look at that and get a little bit more information. This has been so educational.
Thank you. I've had a good time.
I really knew nothing about the WASP.
Yeah.
I probably know maybe a little bit more about the wax, but not much.
Yeah.
And that's one that you hear about a lot more, it seems.
Because they were militarized, and so there's just more documentation.
So this has been so interesting, and I so appreciate you taking your time with us today, Lisa.
Thanks.
This has been great. It's been educational. And the way I always finish out my podcasts is I say the world is full of wonder. This is such an interesting time. People need to get out and explore this history and the achievements of women at that point in time, and the way that it advanced so many things.
Yes.
And everybody have an absolutely wonder-filled day.
All the roll and go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?